everybody. Thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be talking about the business of security, true zero-day threat protection. My name is Eric Rutkowski. I'm president of Landworks. I will be accompanied by Ryan Sinclair from Palo Alto Networks, who will be doing the majority of the webinar here. He'll be talking about a significant feature of the Palo Alto firewall line, which is a licensed option that is effectively providing true zero-day threat protection. Ryan has been with Palo Alto for several months now. A lot of the Canadian team actually are fairly new, and he'll be taking you through the entire webinar. If you do have any questions, please feel free to post them on the sidebar. You can answer the questions. You can minimize also that sidebar. And as I said, if there's any questions or any issues, please don't hesitate to raise your hand. Pass off to Ryan. Thanks.
Thanks, Eric. Just want to take you through today's agenda, and thanks everybody again for joining. So what we're going to talk about up front is today's threat landscape, why it's different than what we've seen even 10 years in the past, and how security needs to change in light of that. What are some of the common traits that we see, and we'll dive deeper into how zero-day threats factor into that. We'll talk about how to reduce the attack surface, so how to reduce the amount of potential attacks that will enter your environment in the first place, and that'll connect into the Palo Alto Networks platform. And then we'll dive into a little bit more detail about the unknown threats themselves and what WildFire actually does and how it works. And then we'll just summarize right at the end and give you some next steps. So I thought it would be best up front, before we dive into the Palo Alto Networks platform from sort of a high level, to talk about exactly what WildFire is. So WildFire it's a licensed threat intelligence feature that's built into our firewall platform that sends unknown or previously uncategorized content to our cloud-based sandbox, where it's opened and executed. So we actually are dynamically launching these unknown files, observing their behavior, as well as doing static code analysis to see exactly what it. And we are making decisions on whether these files are benign or malicious. So we actually do this in a cloud-based environment, again, that runs Windows XP, Windows 7. We can even do this for Android APKs as well. And what we're looking for essentially are, give or take, about 250 malicious behaviors that we observe. And if certain criteria are met and the content is deemed malicious, what we do automatically without administrator intervention is to have protections sent down to the frontline firewalls and actually every other Palo Alto Networks customer who subscribes to the service. And whether it is a malicious URL being accessed or whether it's a command and control IP address that we just learned about, we'll deploy all the necessary protections to make sure that those attacks cannot succeed in your environment. And just to give an idea, we're sniffing out approximately 31,000 new malware files globally per day. So the majority of this webinar is going to be addressing how we attack these zero-day threats, and we'll get into a little bit more details about how WildFire works, but this should sort of set the stage for how we are protecting our customers today from threats that are not just old recycled threats, but threats made specifically for you that nobody, including the typical antivirus vendors, have seen before. And just to keep a number in your head, I'm going to reveal the answer in a couple of slides here, but remember the number 3.5, and this actually has a high amount of comes to breaches and what we've seen. You can probably already guess what that number means. So just to take sort of a step back into what we're seeing in the wild today in terms of the attacks, who's attacking and for what reason. You know, I think when we think of hackers, we have a picture of, you know, a young man who's living in his parents' basement who has nothing better to do than to, for notoriety's sake, break into an environment just to claim that he has, so he can brag to his buddies. You know, very basic primitive attacks, and that certainly was the case at one point. But what's happened is that we've seen a shift from individuals or small groups all of a sudden now being large organized groups with a good amount of funding and who are also patient, who are doing a lot of reconnaissance to be able to get into your environment. So not only the tools have changed and the number of people and how large or how small these groups are, but the motivation. It's for profit now. Could be for a whole number of other reasons as well. So we've definitely seen a shift in why bad guys are attacking, how long they're willing to wait. In some cases, we've seen several months of reconnaissance being done, potentially even years in some larger cases, before successful attacks were launched. So the bad guys are not just looking for the quick 5-minute score anymore, they're willing to wait. So in general, what's changed? With regard to yesterday's attacks, what we would know or categorize as known threats are still used every now and again, but what we've seen is that, as new technologies are introduced into the enterprise, whether it's mobile, the rise of SSL-based web browsing and applications that can do SSL encryption, the number of zero-day exploits that have been released, essentially exposing vulnerabilities in codes of well-known applications that are very likely to live in your environment. The more technologies that are in play, and the more convenient they are in a sense, also presents more risk as well. So the types of attacks that are being launched are vastly more sophisticated than they were in the past, and we'll cover this in a few slides, but yesterday's technology is no longer sufficient to protect yourselves and your company and your brand and your customers against today's attacks that are being launched. So the 3.5 number actually represents the average cost in US dollars for a breach. And this includes the cost to remediate, legal fees that are associated with that, the potential loss in customer loyalty, as well as brand reputation as well. So $3.5 million, again, that's according to the Ponemon Institute in 2014. The cost is likely much larger now, especially if you're a Canadian customer. Do the exchange rate on that, probably looking at over $4 million on average per breach. So in terms of breaches that we have seen, and you're familiar with many of them, so I'm not going to mention it. In almost every case, there are 4 common traits. A port-based firewall that is basically based on ports and protocols allowing or disallowing traffic in. A static IPS, so an intrusion prevention system that sits behind the port-based firewall, acting as a sort of firewall helper, whether it's from the same vendor as an attachment blade or as a completely different set of hardware from a completely different vendor. In almost every case, zero-day malware is used, and at some point along the way to move around the network, ID credentials are hacked. So just to address really, quite a number of these, but the port-based firewall especially, we've noticed that in today's environments, there is a conga line, if you will, of security appliances that are often living behind the perimeter firewall. And it could be anything from an IPS to some sort of denial of service protection, or antivirus, DLP, all the ones up on the screen, you see them there. And not only is that difficult to manage, but if they're from different vendors, now you have to deal with potentially one different console for all of these products. Troubleshooting can be difficult when there is a compromise that's been observed in the environment. Just an absolute overload of, where do I start when I start receiving a whole bunch of logs and warnings from a whole bunch of disparate appliances? How much of that is overlap? Can we actually correlate this information into actionable intelligence? And of course, the cost is prohibitive as well, in that you're probably paying for all these appliances separately, all with their separate maintenance and other costs attached to that. And from a technological standpoint, a lot of these helpers have a limited view of traffic. So the IPS might not see all of the traffic coming through. A web gateway type product might only see web browsing coming over port 80 or port 443, but not other application traffic. So there's a problem with this approach. So I think what a lot of vendors, UTM vendors in particular, have done is they've lumped the majority of these services into one box. And while it does solve, in a sense, a consolidation problem, it introduces a whole new set of problems in terms of particularly performance. If I'm running a firewall, an IPS, a DLP engine, and Lord knows what other services you can tack onto that, what kind of performance can I expect when I turn all of these services on? And oftentimes consumers of these types of products have complained that the advertised throughput for the box is nowhere near what they experience once they start to turn services. And it's inconvenient and not the best use of your investment, quite frankly, to not turn on the features that you want to turn on because the box itself won't be able to handle it. So while there is consolidation in this case, there are significant performance issues. So what we've observed is that the application landscape has from what it was even 5 to 10 years ago, when where email and web were probably the majority of your third-party applications within the environment. But now that you've got SaaS collaboration tools, Facebook, Skype, Gmail, even personal apps that you may or may not be allowing through into your network, we've discovered that over 560 applications can use non-standard ports, and about 260 of them can use tunneling, so they can tunnel other applications and protocols through it, and nearly, just a little above 80 applications can actually avoid security or use encrypted connections altogether. And I believe another number that's not on this slide is that almost 400 applications are capable of delivering files. So today's landscape in terms of what applications we're dealing with is not the same as it was in yesteryear. Ports don't necessarily mean that you know what applications are coming through. IP addresses now with today's environments don't necessarily mean you know the user responsible for that. And packets don't necessarily, equate to content either. So just to get into what Palo Alto Networks does, and I'm not going to spend too much time here because I think most of you are probably familiar with this, but we're an enterprise security platform that enables you to safely enable all applications, that's all applications, through granular use control and to prevent known and unknown threats. And for who? For all users on any device, on any network. And we can do this in all critical places in the network. So not just at the internet gateway. We can do it within the data center. We can do it in a public cloud such as Amazon Web Services. So we want to give you visibility into all of the traffic coming in and out of your environment, regardless of which application or port or user it is, and allow you the flexibility to write your security policies based on that information. So at the end of the day, what you get is superior security with superior total cost of ownership. So the Palo Alto Networks platform, and I'm not going to spend too much time here because you'll see this slide again toward the end. Most know us as the next generation firewall company. Gartner actually gave us, that designation nearly 10 years ago when we started shipping boxes. What we essentially do is we inspect all the traffic. We block known threats. When unknown threats come in, and we're going to talk at length about WildFire in just a bit, we can automatically send those suspect files up into our threat intelligence cloud right at the top there. And in our virtual sandbox environment, we can make a determination whether something is benign or whether it's a piece of malware. And if it is malware, we will deliver a verbose report that says exactly what we observe this file or files doing. Were they changing registry keys? Were they renaming files in the Windows system directory? Were they creating folders? What other, and umpteen hundred other behaviors that we can observe will provide a report, as well as automatically deploy the protections right down to the firewall. A topic potentially for another day would be the endpoint where we now play. That's our Traps platform, which can also benefit from the WildFire integration. So I think the point here is that we have a fully closed loop platform where we do not rely on any third parties for our antivirus signatures, for our IPS signatures, for our sandboxing, or any of those other aspects. You're in-house, if you will. So when we do make a determination on something in the cloud, that's why we can promise, and you may have heard this before, that we can deliver protections on unknown malware that we've just discovered within 15 minutes to not only yourself, but to every WildFire customer that we have. And at this point, there are several thousand of those, as we have, I believe, over 26,000 customers in total that use a Palo Alto Networks platform. So in our mind, the solution to the problem that we just met, either a conga line of appliances or a number of services running on the same box, would be to put them on the same box. But with the hardware architecture that we have, and I'm going to move on to that slide right now, this is actually what makes us, one of the two major things that makes us really next generation firewall. One that I'll describe later is that we actually can do application visibility up front, in that when traffic enters or leaves your environment, we know immediately to pass to another module or appliance what application is responsible for creating that traffic. From a hardware perspective, we actually have physically separated the compute resources between our management plane that you would use for management reporting, for logging, separated that from the data plane, which is going to do your signature matching, your security processing, and your network processing. So when we say that a 10 gigabits per second capable for throughput, and it's 5 gigabits per second with the security functionality turned on, that's the type of performance we expect you to get. Your data plane is busy processing a lot of traffic. Let's say that everybody's watching the World Cup or the Stanley Cup or whatever else is on. You don't have to worry about running a report on your management plane that would potentially topple the firewall over, because the resources are physically separated. One is not going to directly affect the other. So what that leads to is known performance. In terms of what you get with the Palo Networks platform, and I'll elaborate a little bit more on WildFire, which is obviously a part of this, is natively we do what we call App ID, and I briefly described this before, where we do the layer 7 deep packet inspection, where we can know right away which application is responsible for creating that traffic, and you can actually write your security rules, your policies, based on this, where you have to include a port protocol firewall type policy up front, and then on an application blade or a separate unit altogether, write an IPS policy or an application visibility policy behind that. You can say immediately, these are the applications that I want. I'm going to whitelist them, or I'm going to allow them through, and there are several more conditions you can set on that. And what happens is you can inherently deny all the applications that are not included on that list. So if you know what's corporately blessed, if you will, if an attack tries to come through on a non-approved application, on a port protocol firewall, and I've got a couple slides that will explain this, that traffic will come through on a legacy firewall if it's using ports that you already have open. But if it's attempting to use an application that you haven't specifically allowed, that traffic will never even enter into the environment in the first place. So inherently, you're in a better security posture by doing your firewalling and your policies based on the application rather than the port and the protocol. User ID, which again is included with every platform purchase. This is not an extra license, neither is the application ID, is where we can tie IP addresses to users. So you can say, just tie these two ideas together, I'm going to allow Facebook, and actually to an even more granular level, I'm going to allow the viewing of Facebook, but I will not allow uploading or Facebook chat. We actually have that type of visibility into the application traffic coming in. So gone are the days where you have to make an all or nothing decision on things like Facebook, LinkedIn, which are these days required for business purposes, but you don't have to allow it for everybody. And user ID is what can help you, among other things, determine who you want these policies to apply to, rather than the manual mapping of IP addresses to people. The content ID modules, and there are some subscriptions here, would include the threat prevention. So that is essentially our set of antivirus signatures, IPS, and spyware signatures, as well as our URL filtering that we can also do on box. And what's kind of neat about that is that if you want to, again, write policies based on user and URL category, you can tie that in as well. And or if you want to do SSL decryption, which by the way we can do included on the box as an included license, SSL decryption based on URL category. So for example, I want to decrypt everything except for banking information, government, and financials. You can do that with our URL filtering capability. We can also do data filtering, which is almost DLP light, if you will. So if you want to see if anything that looks like a credit card number or a social security number or social insurance number is coming through your environment, you can leverage our platform. So just to give you an example of here, on the left, we've got a Palo Alto Networks App ID enabled firewall. And on the right, I've got a legacy port protocol firewall. And when I say that, that's pretty much all of our competitors, because we're the only ones who do the layer 7 application ID up front. Let's say that we've got DNS traffic coming through. So on the left, we would write our rule based on the application. So in this case, it's DNS. So when we see a legitimate DNS packet come through or traffic come through, we're going to allow that. Write a port protocol rule saying I'm going to allow port 53. So in this case, the DNS traffic makes its way through. However, if I've got a BitTorrent traffic coming in over port 53, the Palo Alto Networks firewall is not going to let that traffic through simply because it's not DNS. And that's the rule we're evaluating. That's all we want to allow in. However, if it's using port 53, the legacy firewall would have no choice but to let it in simply because it's on a port that has been opened. So the solution that a lot of the legacy firewall vendors have come up with is to have an application IPS sitting behind that would have signatures loaded for BitTorrent, and you'd have to write a number of block rules to make sure that that application doesn't get through. So in this case, the BitTorrent attack could be stopped with, potentially with a second appliance or feature sitting behind the firewall. The real issue, and this is going to tie in real well to the topic, today's topic of zero-day threats and attacks, is that if I've got a command and control attack being launched again over port 53, because the application is not DNS, the Palo Alto Networks firewall will once again not allow that traffic through. But the legacy firewall will let the port 53 traffic through, and if it's a new attack that the application IP does not have a signature for, so in other words, it won't be able to block it, it's going to let that traffic through as well. And to rub salt on the wounds a little bit, because it's coming through both devices as approved traffic, it'll be very difficult to parse through the logs and to find out exactly when it's time to troubleshoot and remediate where exactly it came from, because there will be no red flags raised anywhere. So again, that should allow you to see the value of firewalling by application rather than port and protocol. So this inherently leaves you in a more secure position to begin with. So number one, App ID can help you reduce the attack surface as well as the user ID functionality as well. We can also detect the unknown, and that's coming up next with WildFire. I also mentioned SSL decryption, and that's important to note as well, because we see in the average environment now that anywhere between 30 to 50% of the traffic coming through your environment is likely SSL. Seems like Google and Facebook and LinkedIn and everybody turned it on overnight, which is good in a sense, but you want to be able to protect your users from potential infections they can either be sending out or receiving in, so we can do the SSL decryption. And of course, we can, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about WildFire, but we can create, have new protections created once we sandbox any unknown threats that we see come through. So here's where the rubber is going to hit the road. So we've got almost 30,000, 28,000 or so connected security appliances to the WildFire cloud. So that allows us to see a large number of unknown threats that are out there. The one piece that really should hit home is that we actually find a new piece of malware every 3 seconds. And as our customer base continues to grow, and we're probably going to be at 30,000 customers very soon, that's a very significant number of threats that we're finding. And especially considering that, for your American folks out there and Canadians, I suppose, as well, we often see a spike during Black Friday, for malware threats being introduced into the environment, I think for obvious reasons. So we talked about WildFire up front, and essentially, again, this is our zero-day sandboxing platform. So if we have a signature base where a file comes through and the signature base doesn't necessarily believe that this is an attack, but at the same time, we're not sure about it, and you can set a policy on your firewall to say, I want to send all of XYZ file type up to the WildFire cloud for analysis just to be sure this isn't a threat. We'll automatically submit these files up to the cloud, and we can detect unknown malware, exploits, command and control traffic, suspicious DNS queries, as well as malware URLs that previously were never seen before. And I think this graphic probably describes the best how that works. So, shipment.exe is something that comes through on the firewall, and you've got a rule. And for administrators, here's where the ease of use, I think, comes into play. There's no manual intervention required for any of these steps that I'm about to describe. All you need to do is set up a rule, a WildFire submission rule on the firewall saying, these are the file types that I want to be able to send up for analysis, and I want to do it when they're using these applications. So you can say, I want to send up all suspicious EXEs, PDFs, DL, or you can do that just for web browsing. You can do it for any application that's coming through. So this is just essentially a one-time rule creation on the firewall. And if this file, we either don't have a signature for it or we're not sure, we'll automatically submit that up to the cloud. And what's going to happen there is we're going to detonate this file in a sandboxing environment. And again, I mentioned that we use Windows XP, Windows 7. I believe Windows 10 is probably coming soon if we don't have it already. And we can do Android APKs. We will monitor all of the traffic it creates, as well as all the local behaviors that it attempts to manipulate on that machine. And once we make a determination, whether benign or malware, we will report and log on that. If it is malware, we will distribute, again, locally on the firewall or from the web-based console, a verbose report as to exactly what this piece of malware is doing. And again, without administrator intervention, automatically deploy the necessary protections back down to the local firewall. And what's neat about this is that you don't have to see a zero-day threat for the first time to get protected against it. If your next door neighbor who's using Palo Alto networks has seen a threat for the first time and WildFire has made a conviction, because we can deploy these protections every 15 minutes, the whole community of WildFire users benefits from that. So you would receive the protections, against a threat that your next door neighbor has seen, and vice versa. So you can see how, as our customer base grows, it allows us to provide superior protection to all of our customers. So that's kind of it at a high level. And there really isn't much more to it than that, especially from an administrator's perspective. Set the policy on the firewall. We provide full logging and reporting. And again, when we do suspect something is bad and make a conviction on it, we'll tell you exactly why in a nice 2 or 3 page PDF report, sometimes longer, with an exact description of what we observed and why we believe this is bad. And if we submit files up to the cloud that are benign, we'll report on what it wasn't doing as well. And so just in terms of the architecture, it's really easy to sort of picture. So on the left is our WildFire environment, and essentially this service would run from could be your perimeter appliance or wherever you think the most strategic point in your network is for the security device to live. We will automatically, through an internet connection, submit the files up to WildFire and receive the verdicts right back down from the cloud. For those who into sending PDFs, documents, or anything that could potentially contain sensitive company information to our cloud, we do have a local appliance option that actually has the same set of capabilities that it can virtually execute and detonate these files, as well as produce the necessary protections required to ensure that your firewall has the new created signatures that the WildFire cloud would have produced. So the WildFire appliance that could sit locally could do the exact same thing as the cloud-based offering. And we've also seen a hybrid approach where if you've got files that you're almost certain would not contain company information, such as EXEs or screensavers or DLLs, and you have no problem submitting those to the cloud, that's totally fine. But if you do want to make sure that the Word documents and PDFs are sanitized, you can ensure that without sending them to our cloud by deploying a local WildFire that would provide you with the same protection. And what's neat is that considering that we support a wide amount of file types, you can do all of this ideally from one central place in your network. So we don't require a separate service or appliance for web traffic as opposed to email traffic, as opposed to something that may have popped out of a file share. You can do all of this from however many platforms that you have, Palo Alto Networks platforms that you have in your environment. If it's just one sitting at the perimeter, that's totally fine. Number of them, but we don't require a disparate number of appliances to sit that may or may not integrate with each other and could be very costly to manage. You can do all of this ideally from one platform. So on the right, you'll see what some other sandbox vendors have, might be proposing in terms of our complex and expensive, and may not afford you the protection that you would get by using a more integrated solution that we offer in WildFire, with WildFire. So again, we've got over 6,000 WildFire customers. I think this slide's a little bit dated, so I think the number's a lot larger than that. So this is just essentially a summary that we can automatically deploy antivirus, DNS, URL filtering signatures automatically down to every subscriber of the WildFire service as soon as we make a conviction. So just to give you an idea of how many signatures we're generating and the type of velocity that we have, we've got every 50 minutes we're deploying over 100 new antivirus signatures. About it, that's over 400 an hour. Over 200 new DNS signatures every 15 minutes as well. And on a daily basis, we've got north of 13,000 new malicious URLs that we're discovering every day, and this is within WildFire. So again, the threat landscape has changed. A lot of these new malicious URLs are going up on a daily basis. Attacks could be launched literally hours after new malware is created. So this isn't just the bad guys using the old stuff against you and hoping they can trick you. This is the bad guys creating new stuff and launching attacks, perhaps right away, knowing that your typical AV vendor may not have protections or signatures for that file or attack. So here's a brief look at the supported types that we support for WildFire. So your Windows executables, PDFs. PDFs we're actually noticing are a very, very large threat vector these days. So what looks like, perhaps a resume and on pages 1 and 2 can be completely fine, might have some malicious code sitting on page 25. We've seen this happen with Word documents as well. So, you want to be aware of that and protect yourselves against that. So all the Office documents under the sun, as well as Java, and Adobe Flash, and even Android APKs as well. Kind of a bonus to the WildFire protection that you get. So not only are we looking at and executing unknown files in the sandbox, but we can actually look at URLs that are being presented in potentially malicious emails as well. So the WildFire service can actually look at and visit the website as soon as the email comes through, so as soon as the firewall gets visibility over it. And once we make a determination that this is a bad piece of malware, our URL filter category, malware category, is dynamically updated every day, and we automatically can add that new URL to that malware category to make sure that you are protected. And from an administrator perspective, how you would do this is if you are blocking the malware category, that's dynamically updated every day. It does not require you to go back and make any policy changes to your firewall whatsoever. This is all dynamically included. One of the stories that I think you hear in general from a lot of security vendors is that it's only a matter of time before you're going to be hacked, and we want to be there to help you detect and remediate after the fact. So, if you will, more of a, Horatio Kane from CSI Miami approach, where when he shows up, there's already a dead body, but he's got to tell you the story as to how it happened in the first place. As opposed to the approach that we think, we are taking here and what radically separates us from the rest. I believe that prevention is possible, that the bad guys don't have to get in. You don't have to wave the white flag and believe that, I am going to get breached. I just want to make sure I can clean it up quickly. So we take more of a Jack Bauer, if you will, approach to security, in that we do believe that prevention is possible. But at the same time, remediation is still important. So if there is an attack that has somehow gotten through to your environment, let's say that you're not doing SSL decryption and an attack has come through using SSL, WildFire can help you put some pieces together along with our threat prevention license as well to determine which endpoints we believe may be infected. And because we can tie that immediately to the user with our user ID functionality, we can tell you this machine used by this user is very likely infected, and here's the reason why. This particular malicious URL was visited 42 times, and et cetera, et cetera. And we'll give a confidence rating as to how sure we are that that any of the machines on your network might have a bot or some sort of command and control running on it. So we do provide controls to remediate as well, and to give admins a quick idea of who might be infected and why. So again, just to tie this back, and I know we're running a little bit on time here, but a completely closed loop solution, including the cloud-based truly scales, is really what we believe our customers need to protect themselves against today's advanced threats. Again, firewalling by application and inherently denying everything else is exactly what firewalls were meant to do really from the beginning, to whitelist and inherently deny what you don't want. And when we do see something coming in over an approved application, such as web browsing or you name it, Skype, we want to be able to make sure that the content within that stream is sanitized and is not malicious. And if it is, we want to make sure that you protections to ensure that that attack is not going to be able to do any damage in your environment. So, and again, this is all automated and a completely closed loop system dependent on no third-party vendors to make this go. And we don't need at the perimeter network, although that is a very common placement, for firewalls, including our platforms today. We can live in the Amazon Web Services public cloud. We can do a private cloud within the data center, VM to VM integration, and we can also protect mobile devices as well. And we do that with our global protect functionality. So there are many ways and many places where you can deploy us in your environment. And a common question that we get is, you might be thinking, well, I'm using one of those port protocol firewalls, Ryan, that you described. Do I necessarily have to rip and replace my existing offering in order to use Palo Alto Networks? No, not necessarily. You can, and of course we can do that. We can do a full-scale replacement of whatever firewall you're using, and IPS, and whatever other security appliances you use behind that. But we can also peacefully exist with these other platforms, in that we can be just an IPS, we can be just the URL filter, we can be there just for the unknown malware protection, so for WildFire, or we can just be sitting off of a span port doing application visibility, because maybe your port protocol firewall doesn't have a helper that tells you which applications are generating that traffic. We can help you gain visibility into this as well. And in terms of the mechanics of how this would work, if you wanted to put our solution in play, you've probably gathered that doing the application visibility up front is dramatically a different way of firewalling. So the question might arise, do I need to write all of my firewall rules all over again if I migrate from whatever platform I'm using to yours? And the answer is that we've actually generated a pretty cool migration tool that can essentially do 90% or more of the work for you. So based on what we're seeing from your existing offering, and there are a number that we support on the left there, we can take those port protocol firewalls, translate them into application ID enabled rules to make the migration process a lot simpler. So just to wrap up here, guys, feel free to contact, again, a no obligation evaluation. We can simply sit off of a span port, typically on your core switch where most of the traffic is coming through, and we can present a report back to you. It's called the Security Lifecycle Review. We can give you a sort of verbose report on what traffic was coming through, what applications were generating it, what threats did we see, and we can also leverage the WildFire sandbox to submit to make sure that, to determine whether it's a piece of malware or not, and give you again, a verbose report on that. And so again, we would leave this appliance in your environment for 7 days typically, and it's not going to interrupt any production traffic because we would just be sitting off of a span port. All we would need is essentially a management IP address and a DNS server to reach out for updates, and we'd be able to produce this report for you. So in terms of content, everybody, that's all I've got. I guess we'll just look over the questions to see what we need to answer there. So the one question that I see here is that are the WildFire updates incrementals? So if I miss one update, will the next update get previous signatures? I do believe that the WildFire updates are incremental, and again, we can have these deployed as aggressively as every 15 minutes. or for non-WildFire subscription customers, you would be able to get those updates just once a day. So that's every 24 hours. Subscribers would get these updates every 50 minutes. So again, I do believe that the updates are incremental and would need to be layered on top of each other. And again, you can be as aggressive as every 15 minutes if you want to with that level of protection. And this question, I think I addressed this earlier, but a question about confidentiality. So for example, the PDF or Word document that's got company sensitive information, if we don't send this up to the cloud, the solution would be, as I alluded to briefly earlier, would be you can deploy a local WildFire appliance that same capability to deliver all the protections as well as do all the local sandboxing and convictions that we can do in the cloud. So if you're sensitive about certain file types, so we can go down to that level as well, leaving and going into our cloud, that would be the solution that we would propose. So you can either use the local appliance for everything, or you can do a hybrid approach where screensavers and EXEs and DLLs, which probably would not contain sensitive company info, would be going up to the cloud. This is an important question as well, and I'm glad this one was asked, as well as the others as well. Does this solution need extensive care and feeding from my IT staff, much like an IPS would? In short, I believe the answer is no. And part of the reason why is that if you go to an application-based security policy, you will automatically be weeding out a lot of traffic that could potentially be causing you problems from a security and incident response perspective right from the get-go by, again, not allowing anything that's not on your whitelist to come through. It's extremely easy to pull ad hoc reports, or if you've got, looking over your shoulder to, say, hey, how secure we are and, what kind of traffic we're seeing coming through our environment. We've got an application control center or command center that can give you a very nice visual representation of what the environment's looking like, how many threats have come through and for which users. And the great thing is that you don't need to be a expert in order to pull this off. We do, I should have mentioned this as well, have Panorama, which is our central management platform, where if you've got, for example, 10 pairs of firewalls or more, you can manage all this from a single pane of glass, and it should not require a lot of sort of day-to-day, like you might have from, again, a number of appliances that are incapable of integrating with each other and sharing information. And another question was, about the firewall that we would potentially use for a security lifecycle report. We would provide that. So essentially, what would happen is we would, quote unquote, fly the box in, and we'd be able to just connect to a span port, get all the information off of, from your environment that we need. Come back about a week or so later and present that report to you, not with marketing slides, but with a whole bunch of information coming directly from your environment and what we saw. And so last question that I'm seeing, and there may be more pouring in, so privacy within the Palo Alto cloud. So just to say up front for our Canadian customers, the cloud is located in the United States. I believe there is another cloud that we use in Japan as well. What I am going to have to look into, and this is kind of a part B to this question, is do we retain the files, and if so, for how long? I don't believe that we do, especially if they are benign. If they are malware, we may retain that file for some period of time. I'm not quite sure, but I would imagine it would just be long enough to make sure that we create the necessary protections against that piece of malware. And another question has come in terms of how internal threats could be potentially controlled within the solution. And one of the ways that we do that, and it's not something I got into in a great amount of detail, because often we're talking about traffic between the inside and the outside being the internet, is that we can actually configure security zones within the environment. So depending on where you're terminating your switches or where your users live, you can sanitize and control traffic from one zone to another, and ensure that only X amount of users, or these particular users, can use this application in this zone. So a good example would be, I'm going to allow SSH, but I'm only going to allow it for IT users, and they can only use this application when connecting to this zone or this part of my network. So in terms of internal threats, you can sanitize the internal traffic that way as well. And I briefly alluded to, we have an integration with VMware. We can also do this in a sense without VMware as well, where we can control traffic traveling from, let's say, one ESX host to another. So for example, if there's already a threat that has been executed against your environment, the bad guy's already squatting within your data center, what he's doing now that he's in is he may have to move around east-west within the environment to get to the crown jewels, if you will, and then attempt to send them back out. We can also sanitize the traffic from one ESX host to another or one VM guest to another to make sure that that attack never reaches that stage, so the bad guy essentially is going to be unsuccessful because there'll be nothing to exfiltrate. So yeah, that's how we sort of handle the internal threats as well as threats that may already be living in the environment. So we don't. Oftentimes we hear customers telling us that I might have a kind of coconut type environment, hard and crunchy in a sense on the outside, but gooey and too easy to navigate on the inside. That's how we would solve that problem in a sense of making sure that traffic moving east and west underneath the visibility of the perimeter firewall is sanitized as well.
Okay, that concludes our webinar for today. We will be sending you a copy of the recorded webinar for reference, and we will provide our contact details. If you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be happy to answer them. Thank you again for participating. We really appreciate your time. Have a great afternoon.